There is an ancient principle in nuclear deterrence. Strategic ambiguity only works when your adversary believes you might use it. For 32 years, Russia maintained that balance perfectly. But on November 19, 2024, in a closed meeting of the Russian Security Council, broadcast in selected fragments, Vladimir Putin shattered that ambiguity with 47 words that NATO was not prepared to hear. Putin signed the revision of Russia's nuclear doctrine live on camera. The document was not classified. It was immediately published on the Kremlin website, and the key change was in Article 19, Paragraph 3. Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response to a conventional attack that threatens the territorial integrity of the Russian state or its allies, including attacks facilitated or coordinated by nuclear powers. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General who had spent 10 years managing the relationship with Russia, received the translated document at 11:43 a.m. Brussels time. 57 minutes later, he convened an emergency meeting of the North Atlantic Council. The meeting lasted 4 hours and 22 minutes. There was no press release afterward, only silence. What the corporate media doesn't want you to know is this, that silence was not diplomacy, it was panic. Because those 47 words in Article 19 mean that if the United States provides ATACMS missiles to Ukraine to attack Russian territory, and Ukraine uses them, Russia considers that a coordinated attack by a nuclear power that justifies a nuclear response. Not against Ukraine, against the NATO bases that provided the missiles. I worked at the International Monetary Fund for 11 years, analyzing sovereign risk scenarios and security escalation calculations in Eastern Europe. I've seen this pattern before. When a nuclear power publicly revises its doctrine to lower the threshold of use, it's not bluffing. It's establishing legal red lines that allow it to act without violating its own law. This is not a story about nuclear rhetoric. It's a story about how the world's most powerful empire just discovered it cannot arm Ukraine indefinitely, expand NATO to Russia's borders, and maintain controlled escalation simultaneously. Putin just eliminated the controlled escalation option from the board. Let's go back 33 years to understand the systematic betrayal that turned nuclear deterrence into political theater. In February 1990, Secretary of State James Baker met with Mikhail Gorbachev and explicitly promised, NATO will not expand 1 inch eastward if the Soviet Union allows German reunification. That promise is recorded. Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, repeated the same guarantee. It was documented in diplomatic memorandums. In 1999, NATO violated that promise by admitting Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. In 2004, it added Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia, 7 more countries. In 2009, Albania and Croatia. In 2017, Montenegro. In 2020, North Macedonia. In 2023, Finland and Sweden. NATO went from 16 members in 1990 to 32 members in 2024. But here's what they never told you on CNN. Each expansion placed NATO military infrastructure closer to Moscow. Missile bases in Poland and Romania are 1,200 kilometers from Moscow. F-35s based in Estonia can reach St. Petersburg in 11 minutes of flight time. Warning time for ballistic missiles launched from the Baltic states to Russian targets, less than 5 minutes. For context, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the United States almost initiated a nuclear war because Soviet missiles in Cuba were 90 miles from Florida. NATO missiles are now closer to Moscow than Cuban missiles were to Washington. But when Russia protests, the West calls it imperialist paranoia. In December 2021, Putin presented formal treaty proposals to the United States and NATO. The core demands: legally binding guarantees that Ukraine would never join NATO, and withdrawal of NATO forces from countries that joined after 1997. The United States rejected the proposals without negotiation. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's response: The sovereign principles of nations to choose their own alliances are non-negotiable. 2 months later, Russia invaded Ukraine. Here's the number the State Department never mentions. Between 1991 and 2021, the United States spent $97 billion in military and economic aid to Eastern European states, specifically to integrate them into Western structures. 97 billion. All that money went to building NATO infrastructure around Russia. $0 were spent fulfilling the security guarantees promised to Moscow in 1990. When the Ukraine war began in February 2022, the United States immediately provided $113 billion in military aid to Ukraine over 2 years. That includes HIMARS systems, Abrams tanks, F-16 fighters, and ATACMS missiles with a 300-kilometer range capable of striking deep inside Russian territory. In September 2024, President Biden authorized Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles against targets inside Russia. Not military targets in disputed territories, targets inside internationally recognized Russia. On November 17, 2024, Ukraine fired 6 ATACMS missiles at a military installation in the Bryansk region, 110 kilometers inside Russia. 48 hours later, Putin signed the new nuclear doctrine. The message is crystal clear. If the United States gives Ukraine long-range weapons and Ukraine uses them against Russian territory, Russia considers that an act of war by the United States that justifies a nuclear response. It's not rhetoric, it's legal doctrine. So what happened? NATO built its entire strategy on the assumption that Russia would never use nuclear weapons except in response to a direct nuclear attack. Putin just eliminated that assumption, and every escalation calculator in every NATO capital just became useless. General Christopher Cavoli, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, now faces a nightmare scenario unprecedented since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cavoli, who oversees 3.5 million NATO troops and a combined defense budget of $1.2 trillion annually, must confront an impossible mathematical reality. Russia just lowered the nuclear threshold so dramatically that every ATACMS missile fired toward Russia could trigger a tactical nuclear response. Russian tactical nuclear weapons are 0.3 to 50 kiloton warheads designed for battlefield use. Russia has approximately 1,900 of these weapons deployed. A single 10-kiloton warhead detonated over Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the nerve center of NATO operations, would kill 35,000 to 50,000 people instantly and contaminate 200 square kilometers for decades. NATO's defense budget is $1.2 trillion combined. Sounds invincible until you realize half of that is U.S. spending, $842 billion, and 73% of the U.S. budget goes to personnel and maintenance, not nuclear war capability. European NATO spending is approximately $350 billion annually. Of that, only Germany, France, and the United Kingdom maintain nuclear capabilities or extended deterrence. But here's the problem. NATO's nuclear deterrence always depended on escalation credibility. The logic: if Russia attacks a NATO state, the United States responds with massive conventional force. If Russia escalates to tactical nuclear, the United States escalates to strategic nuclear, ensuring mutual destruction. That credible threat kept the peace for 75 years. Putin just destroyed that logic by declaring that Russia will use nuclear weapons in response to conventional attacks that threaten its territorial integrity. That means if NATO provides weapons that enable Ukraine to attack Russian territory, Russia can use nuclear weapons first, before NATO escalates, eliminating NATO's escalation advantage. You can't declare war on your own banker. And here's the brutal irony. The United States must now ask China, its strategic rival, to pressure Russia not to implement its new nuclear doctrine, while simultaneously sanctioning Chinese companies and threatening Taiwan. Beijing watches this circus and wonders, why would we help an empire that threatens us? For 75 years, the United States had a magic trick in Europe. It could threaten massive conventional force without risking nuclear escalation because everyone assumed Russia would only use nuclear weapons defensively. That trick just died, and every military planner in every European capital knows it. Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, convened a classified call with NATO defense ministers on November 21st. The call lasted 3 hours and 47 minutes. According to cables leaked to the Washington Post, Austin attempted to assure European allies that the new Russian doctrine is rhetoric designed to intimidate, not genuine policy. Polish Defense Minister Mariusz Błaszczak responded with a simple question. If it's just rhetoric, is the United States willing to guarantee in writing that it will defend Poland if Russia uses a tactical nuclear weapon in response to NATO-facilitated Ukrainian attacks? Austin had no answer. The call ended without consensus. Now I want to mention John Mearsheimer here, professor at the University of Chicago and the most influential strategic thinker on nuclear policy since the Cold War. Mearsheimer predicted this exact moment in his 2014 analysis, Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault. His central argument: expanding NATO eastward while ignoring Russia's core security interests would eventually force Russia to respond with force. And when a nuclear power with its back against the wall responds, escalation options become unpredictable and dangerous. What we are witnessing is real-time validation of Mearsheimer's theory. Russia is not being irrational or aggressive. It's responding rationally to an existential threat created by 33 years of NATO expansion and arming of states on its borders. And its response is to lower the nuclear threshold, making the cost of continuing that arming potentially catastrophic. Mearsheimer also wrote about the concept of nuclear coercive diplomacy. When a state feels its survival is threatened, it uses the specter of nuclear weapons not to attack, but to force adversaries to reconsider policies. That's exactly what Putin did. The new doctrine is not designed to launch nuclear weapons. It's designed to make NATO reconsider arming Ukraine with long-range systems. Kenneth Waltz, the founder of structural neorealism, argued that nuclear weapons create peace through the balance of terror. But Waltz also warned, the balance only works when both sides understand each other's red lines. When one side constantly pushes those lines without consequences, the balance collapses. NATO pushed for 33 years. Putin just re-established the balance with a single document. Putin's nuclear doctrine revision is not just about Ukraine. It's Moscow sending a signal to every NATO capital. The era of expansion without consequences is over. You can accept a European security system that respects Russian interests, or you can force a nuclear confrontation. But gradual pushing without risk is finished. What we are witnessing is the collapse of two pillars that have sustained European security since 1991. The first pillar, the assumption that NATO expansion was inevitable and unstoppable. The second pillar, the assumption that Russia would only use nuclear weapons defensively. Putin just destroyed both pillars with 47 words in a legal document. For 30 years, European security architecture operated on a simple premise. NATO would expand eastward. Russia would protest but ultimately accept because nuclear war was unthinkable. It was a system that worked while Russia was weak and divided under Yeltsin. But Putin rebuilt the Russian state, modernized its nuclear arsenal to 5,889 total warheads, and has now declared he will use those weapons if Russian territorial integrity is threatened by conventional attacks facilitated by nuclear powers. That's not a minor change. It's a seismic shift in European strategic calculation. The numbers show why NATO is panicking. Russia has 1,900 tactical nuclear weapons deployed. NATO has approximately 200 U.S. tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. Russia has 9-to-1 superiority in battlefield nuclear weapons. If Putin decides to demonstrate credibility by using a 5-kiloton warhead against a NATO supply convoy in western Ukraine, how does the United States respond without triggering Armageddon? The answer is, it can't. Any U.S. nuclear response would trigger larger Russian retaliation. Any non-nuclear response would look weak and invite further aggression. It's a no-solution dilemma, and Putin created it intentionally. BRICS is watching this collapse and building alternatives. Russia and China have conducted 27 joint military exercises since 2022. Iran provides drones to Russia and receives satellite technology. North Korea sent 11,000 troops to Russia and receives missile technology. The multipolar security architecture is not future, it's present, and it's centered on Moscow and Beijing, not Washington. The transition has already happened. The world simply hasn't realized it yet. The US-dominated European security order that emerged in 1991 is dying. What's replacing it is a system where Russia has nuclear veto over NATO policies that threaten its core interests. And here's what makes this irreversible. The cost of challenging Russia's new nuclear doctrine now includes possible nuclear annihilation. Europe is not willing to pay that cost. Poland, the Baltic states, Romania may rhetorically support Ukraine, but when Putin asks, "Are you willing to have Warsaw vaporized over an ATACMS missile fired from Ukraine?" the answer will be no. Are you enjoying the analysis? This is exactly what mainstream media won't show you, because it challenges the narrative that Putin is isolated and weak. If you find this content valuable, hit that subscribe button right now. Join the thousands of people who are waking up to the reality of how nuclear power actually works in the international system. And if this analysis is opening your eyes, give it a like so more people can find it. Algorithmic censorship is real, and your engagement directly fights that. Let me know in the comments. Where are you watching this from? I want to know where our global community is. Moscow, Berlin, Paris, Buenos Aires? Let's build this network of informed people together. Now let's talk about what this means for your wallet, because this is not just a story of abstract nuclear doctrine. It's a story about your economic future. When Putin signed that new nuclear doctrine, he didn't just change military calculations. He threatened the entire system that allows Europe to maintain high living standards. Here's how. Europe imports 40% of its natural gas and 27% of its oil from Russia. That energy trade is worth 180 billion euros annually. Every time NATO escalates the Ukraine conflict, Russia implicitly threatens that energy flow. The new nuclear doctrine means any further NATO escalation in Ukraine now carries risk of nuclear response. That makes investors and energy markets panic. European natural gas futures already increased 34% in the 72 hours after Putin signed the doctrine. Electricity prices in Germany increased 28%. Your energy bills, if you live in Europe, just went up permanently. But the real impact is on market confidence. German government bonds, traditionally Europe's safest asset, saw yields jump 18 basis points in 1 week. Investors are pricing nuclear war risk into European assets for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Your pension, if it's invested in European funds, just lost 4 to 7% of value. Your savings, if they're in European banks, now face risk of capital controls if escalation continues. Your mortgage, if you have a variable rate, will see rate increases as central banks grapple with the confidence shock. And here's the brutal part. This is just the beginning. If NATO continues arming Ukraine with long-range systems and Russia responds with a demonstrative tactical nuclear weapon, European financial markets will collapse. The euro could fall 30 to 40% against the dollar in days. Stock markets would lose $4 to $6 trillion in market capitalization. The United States is not immune. 38% of U.S. exports go to Europe. If Europe enters recession due to a nuclear crisis, U.S. companies lose $670 billion annually in revenue. Your 401k portfolio, if it contains Apple, Microsoft, Boeing stocks, will see them drop 15 to 25%. But here's the hope. The collapse of NATO unipolarity does not mean civilization collapse. It means transition to a European security system that respects legitimate Russian interests. A system where Finland can trade with Russia, Germany can buy Russian gas, and Europe doesn't have to choose between prosperity and loyalty to Washington. If you're young building wealth, understand that European assets now carry nuclear risk premium. Diversify toward markets not on the front line of NATO-Russia confrontation. If you have savings in euros, consider physical gold or Swiss francs. If you have pension in European funds, ask about geopolitical risk exposure. If you're middle class just trying to survive, recognize your energy bills are rising not from quote-unquote corporate greed, but because your government chose to escalate a conflict with a nuclear power. And that cost is paid by you, not the politicians who made those decisions. Putin's nuclear doctrine revision is not just a legal document. It's a symbol of massive historical shift. It's Moscow demonstrating that the unipolar order, where the United States dictates security terms, is over. It's Russia saying, you can have NATO expansion or you can have nuclear stability, but you cannot have both. Stay alert, stay informed, stay ahead of official narratives that insist Russia is bluffing. They're not bluffing. They're establishing legal red lines. And history shows that when nuclear powers establish legal red lines and they're crossed, the consequences are catastrophic. You are witnessing how the fundamentals of 75 years of European security order are being reorganized. Not in theory, not in the future, right now, this week. With 47 words in a legal document and a simple message from Moscow to Brussels, the era of expansion without consequences is over.